My name is Ellen Carter, and I'm 42 years old. I never imagined the words I'd hear on my mother's birthday would shatter me so deeply. In front of everyone, my mother looked me straight in the eye and said, "The only gift I want is for you to disappear." The laughter in the room died. My chest tightened, but I forced myself to stand tall. Without another word, I walked out into the cold night rain, leaving behind the stares, the whispers, and the life I had sacrificed everything for. Before I take you further into my journey, let me know where you're watching from today. Hit that like button, and subscribe if you want more stories about family betrayal and the courage it takes to break free. Under the yellow glow of the restaurant chandeliers, everything had seemed carefully arranged, balloons tied to chairs, a cake on display with my mother's name written in careful icing, and relatives chatting politely over glasses of wine. From the outside, it looked like a perfect celebration, the kind you'd see on a greeting card. But I knew better. Behind the smiles, my family carried unspoken rules. You were either loyal to my mother, or you were the enemy. That night, I tried to be invisible. I stood near the back, helping arrange napkins, passing around plates, keeping my voice low. I wanted nothing more than to honor her, to avoid confrontation, to simply be part of the evening. But when she opened her mouth and delivered that line, "The only gift I want is for you to disappear," the world tilted. For a moment I thought I had misheard. The clinking of silverware stopped. Even the background music seemed to fade. My cousin coughed awkwardly. My aunt looked down at her shoes. And my mother smirked. There it was again, that sharp edge she always carried. She had dressed in an elegant blue dress that night, her silver hair perfectly curled, her lipstick bold. She looked like a queen holding court, and in that moment she wanted me humiliated before her audience. I saw the satisfaction in her eyes when gasps circled the room. I felt heat rise in my chest, but at the same time a strange calm washed over me. I had been preparing for this moment for years without even realizing it. You don't live under constant criticism without learning how to mask your pain. So I lifted my chin, steadied my voice, and told her quietly, "Then I'll give you exactly what you want." My heels clicked softly against the polished floor as I walked toward the exit. No one moved to stop me. The rain outside greeted me like an old friend, sharp and cold against my skin. The scent of wet asphalt filled my lungs. My hair clung to my cheeks, mascara streaked down my face, but it almost felt cleansing. Each step away from that restaurant felt like peeling off another layer of the chains she had wrapped around me. I remember looking back through the glass doors just once. I could still see her standing there, triumphant, while guests whispered to each other, and I thought, so this is it. This is the night she finally cut me off completely. A shiver ran through me, not from the cold, but from the weight of realization. I no longer had a place in that family, not in the way I used to. I didn't have a plan. I didn't even know where I would sleep, but I knew one thing with certainty. If I turned back, if I begged, if I tried to reason with her yet again, I would be lost forever. So I kept walking. The city streets were quiet, puddles reflecting neon signs from closed shops. My shoes soaked through quickly, but I didn't care. For the first time in years, I wasn't performing. I wasn't bending myself into shapes to keep her satisfied. I was simply existing, alone with my pain and my freedom, both wrapped tightly around me. Later that night, sitting behind the wheel of my old sedan, I let the engine idle while raindrops drummed on the roof. My hands gripped the steering wheel, trembling. I thought about all the birthdays, holidays, and sacrifices that had brought me here. I thought about the scholarship I gave up, the nights I stayed awake tending to her after her accident, the countless times I swallowed my own dreams so she wouldn't feel abandoned. And I realized something. What happened at that party wasn't the beginning of my exile. It was just the first time she had made her rejection public. The truth was, she had been pushing me out of my own life for decades. The rain slowed to a drizzle, and I finally pulled out of the parking lot. I didn't know where I was headed, only that I couldn't go back. Somewhere deep inside, a small voice whispered, "Maybe this is your chance, Ellen. Maybe this is the night you start living for yourself." It was terrifying, yes, but as the road stretched out before me, a flicker of something else stirred in my chest, something I hadn't felt in years. It was hope. Underneath the polished decorations and the carefully arranged birthday banquet, there was a tension so sharp I could almost taste it. My mother, Margaret, had always loved appearances. To anyone else in that room, she looked radiant, the center of attention, surrounded by friends, neighbors, and distant relatives who came to honor her turning 65. To me, she looked like the same woman who had dictated every part of my life since I was old enough to understand what the word obedience meant. I stood near the cake table, trying to blend into the background. People were laughing, glasses clinking, music humming low, but I felt like a ghost haunting my own family. Every time someone asked how I was doing, I gave the polite smile, the quick answer, then retreated before the conversation could go deeper. I had learned long ago that any truth about me, my dreams, my disappointments, would eventually be turned into ammunition. Then came the moment. Margaret, my mother, held her glass high, smiling that practiced smile. Her voice carried across the room with ease, the kind of voice people listen to out of respect or maybe fear. And then, in front of every single person, she turned to me and said, "The only gift I want is for you to disappear." At first I thought maybe she was joking. A cruel joke, but a joke nonetheless. But when the laughter faltered, when forks hit plates in stunned silence, I realized she meant it. She wasn't teasing, she wasn't exaggerating. She wanted me gone, and she wanted everyone to witness it. I felt the eyes on me. Cousins, old neighbors, even strangers who had no idea what history lived between us. My throat tightened. Part of me wanted to scream, to tell the truth about all the years I'd sacrificed, about the scholarship I had turned down, about the nights I'd sat at her bedside after her accident while my friends built their lives. I wanted to shout that I wasn't a burden. I wasn't unworthy. But the words stayed locked inside my chest, heavy and useless. Instead, I did the only thing I knew how to do. I stayed calm. I straightened my shoulders, forced a half smile, and said quietly, "Then I'll give you exactly what you want." The scrape of my chair against the floor seemed louder than the music. My shoes clicked on the tiles as I made my way toward the door. No one stopped me. No one called my name. In that moment, it was as though I truly had become invisible, exactly as she wished. When I pushed the door open, the night air rushed in, cool and damp. Rain had begun to fall, the kind of steady drizzle that soaks you in minutes. I didn't care. The cold felt almost comforting compared to the heat in my chest. Each drop of water that hit my face felt like a baptism, washing away the humiliation, the years of silent resentment. I crossed the parking lot, the sound of the party muffled behind me. My car waited under a flickering streetlight, its paint dulled from years of use. But it was mine, my only refuge. Sliding into the driver's seat, I gripped the steering wheel, trembling. I looked back once, through the blur of rain on the windshield. Through the glass doors of the banquet hall, I could still see her, Margaret, standing tall, surrounded by people who would pretend not to remember what she had said. Tears welled up, but I didn't let them fall. Not yet. I turned the key and the engine came alive with a tired groan. The headlights cut through the rain and I pulled out of the lot. I had no destination, no plan, but one truth had crystallized in my mind. That birthday party wasn't just a celebration of her life. It was the funeral of mine, the version of me that lived only for her approval, that bent and broke to fit into the mold she wanted. I knew as the road stretched out before me that something had ended. But maybe, just maybe, something new had begun. The rain kept falling, steady and unrelenting, but inside I felt the smallest flicker of something I hadn't felt in years. It was fragile, but it was real. It was freedom. The highway stretched out in front of me like an endless ribbon of wet asphalt, glistening under the harsh glow of streetlights. Wipers swiped across the windshield in frantic arcs, never quite fast enough to clear the downpour. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white, but I barely noticed. My mind replayed the scene from the party over and over, each word from my mother echoing louder than the rain. I could still see her face in my mind's eye, calm and cold as she dismissed me like I was nothing. Every mile I drove seemed to carry her voice along with me. "Disappear." I pressed harder on the accelerator as if distance alone could put space between me and that command. But the truth was, her words had already carved themselves into my bones. Headlights from oncoming cars blurred through the rain, streaking like broken glass across my vision. For a moment, I thought about how easy it would be to lose myself completely, to let the wheel slip, to stop fighting. But I forced that thought away. I wasn't ready to surrender, not yet. I rolled the window down just an inch, letting the damp air wash over me. The smell of wet pavement filled the car, sharp and strangely grounding. Somewhere inside the storm of my emotions, a voice whispered that I had a choice. I could keep driving into nothingness, or I could stop, breathe, and face the silence I'd been running from my whole life. A neon sign flickered in the distance, cutting through the haze. It was a small roadside motel, the kind you barely notice in daylight but can't miss in the dark. The letters buzzed faintly, casting a pink glow on the rain-soaked parking lot. My gas gauge hovered near empty, and exhaustion had already begun to weigh down my eyelids. I knew I couldn't keep pushing through the night. Pulling into the lot, I cut the engine and just sat there, listening to the rain hammering against the roof. My reflection stared back at me from the rearview mirror, pale, hollow-eyed, streaks of mascara tracing down my cheeks. I barely recognized the woman looking back. She wasn't the obedient daughter anymore, the one who bowed her head and said yes to every demand. She was a stranger, someone I hadn't met yet, someone I was about to become. When I finally stepped out of the car, the rain clung to me instantly, chilling me to the bone. But as I walked toward the motel office, something in me felt lighter. For the first time in decades, I wasn't going back home. And that realization, terrifying as it was, carried the faintest spark of hope. The motel room smelled faintly of old carpet and lemon-scented cleaner, the kind of place built for people passing through and never staying long. The wallpaper was faded, the lamp wobbled when I switched it on, and the bedspread was patterned with flowers that had long since lost their color. But it was dry, it was quiet, and for the first time in hours I could hear myself think. I set my bag down on the chair and sank onto the bed, the springs creaking beneath me. The silence felt heavy, almost foreign after years of living under my mother's constant commentary. My whole life, Margaret's voice had been inescapable, telling me what to wear, what to eat, what to believe about myself. And now, in this room, all I could hear was the hum of the air conditioner and the rain still pattering against the window. I caught sight of myself in the mirror above the dresser. The woman staring back looked older than 42. Her eyes were swollen, her hair damp and tangled, but what startled me most was the emptiness in her expression. I whispered aloud, "Who are you?" As if maybe she could answer. For a long moment, it felt like I was looking at a stranger. Memories pressed in like waves. The scholarship letter I had once held in my hands, bright and full of promise. The day I tore it in half because my mother needed me at home after her accident. The countless small decisions that weren't really mine, moments when my own voice was drowned out by hers. I had thought I was being dutiful, loving, even noble. But sitting here now, I saw it for what it was. A life slowly erased. I pulled my phone from my bag and stared at the dark screen. My thumb hovered, tempted to call someone, anyone, for reassurance. But who would I call? Friends had drifted away years ago, after too many canceled plans and unanswered texts. My world had narrowed to my mother's orbit, and stepping out of it now felt like floating into space without gravity. Finally, I opened the browser and typed in words I never thought I'd search for. Support for toxic family relationships. The results glowed back at me, a long list of organizations, forums, and helplines. For the first time in years, there was a flicker of possibility. A whisper that maybe I wasn't as alone as I thought. I closed the phone and lay back on the bed, staring at the cracked ceiling. The storm outside was easing, but inside me the storm was only beginning. Still, as I pulled the thin blanket over myself, I held on to that fragile thought. Maybe tonight, in this tired little motel room, was the first night of a different kind of life. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I closed my eyes, the image of my mother at the head of that banquet table came back to me. Her face, composed and proud, the sharpness in her voice as she dismissed me in front of everyone, it played like a broken record in my mind. I tossed and turned on the stiff mattress, listening to the rain taper off into silence. By dawn, exhaustion had set in, but so had a strange clarity. I sat at the edge of the bed, staring at the dim light creeping through the curtains. I thought about how much of my life had been shaped by that woman, how every choice I'd made seemed tied to her approval. It was as if I had been carrying her weight on my back for decades, and last night she made it very clear. She never wanted me to carry it in the first place. She wanted me gone. I remembered the girl I used to be, The one who loved painting late into the night, who dreamed of studios and galleries, of colors splashed across canvas instead of schedules dictated by obligation. That girl had been silenced, smothered under layers of duty. Sitting there in the motel room, I wondered if she was still inside me somewhere, waiting to be let out. The coffee machine in the corner sputtered to life, filling the air with the bitter smell of instant coffee. I poured a cup and cradled it in my hands, letting the heat seep into my fingers. The first sip was harsh but grounding. My mind kept circling one thought. I can't go back. I couldn't return to that house, to her rules, to the constant criticism. Last night was humiliating, yes, but maybe it was also the push I needed, the crack in the wall that would finally let me see the sky. I opened my phone again, scrolling through the websites I had found. Stories from strangers filled the screen. People who had broken free from controlling parents, people who had rebuilt lives from the ground up. Some spoke of therapy, others of support groups, others of simply walking away. Every word I read made me feel a little less alone. For the first time in a long time, I let myself imagine what freedom might look like. Not the absence of responsibility, but the presence of choice. The ability to wake up in the morning and decide for myself how to spend the day. It was a fragile vision, but it was mine. And as the sun finally broke through the clouds, casting light into that small, worn-down room, I whispered a quiet promise to myself. This isn't the end. It's the beginning. By late morning, the rain had stopped, leaving the parking lot slick and shining like a mirror. I stood by the window, holding the thin motel curtain aside, staring at the world outside as though it belonged to someone else. Cars passed on the highway, people moved through their lives with purpose, and I felt like I was standing at the edge of mine, unsure which way to turn. Sleep-deprived and raw, I ran cold water over my face at the sink and studied the reflection that met me. My cheeks were blotchy, my eyes swollen, but there was something new in my expression too, an edge of defiance, a whisper of resolve. For the first time in years, there was no schedule taped to the refrigerator, no list of chores dictated by my mother's voice, no footsteps creaking in the hallway to remind me of her constant presence. The silence felt both terrifying and liberating. I sat on the bed and reached for the small notepad and pen the motel had left on the nightstand. My hands shook as I began to write. At first it was just fragments, words like freedom, fear, alone, new start. But soon the sentences grew longer. I wrote about the scholarship I'd lost, the art I abandoned, the friends who drifted away because I was always tethered at home. I wrote about the years spent cooking her meals, driving her to appointments, absorbing every sharp comment until I believed them myself. The words spilled out faster than I could stop them, as if they had been waiting for release all along. When I finally put the pen down, pages were filled with the story of a life lived in shadows. I pressed the notebook closed and held it to my chest, as though I had captured a part of myself I thought had died. The silence pressed in again, but this time, it didn't feel empty. It felt like a pause, a chance to breathe. I picked up my phone and typed another search. Support groups, Boston family estrangement. More results appeared, names of organizations and hotlines I'd never known existed. One in particular caught my eye, an evening meeting at a community center not far from where I'd grown up. Just reading the description, a safe place for adults healing from toxic family relationships, brought a lump to my throat. For years I had believed I was the only one, that to step away from my mother was an act of betrayal, a shameful secret no one would understand. But here were strangers, gathering week after week, carrying their own scars, daring to speak their truth out loud. Could I sit in a room like that? Could I tell my story without crumbling? The thought terrified me, but it also lit something inside me I hadn't felt in years. Hope. I folded the paper with the address into my wallet and sat quietly for a long time, listening to the faint hum of traffic outside. The day stretched ahead of me, blank and uncertain. And yet, that blankness no longer felt like a void. It felt like a canvas. For the first time since I was a young girl, I thought about paintbrushes, about colors that spoke louder than words, about creating something that belonged only to me. That afternoon, I walked to the gas station nearby, bought a fresh cup of coffee, and felt the sun warming my shoulders. The world seemed strangely alive, children laughing as they splashed through puddles, a couple arguing softly by their car, the smell of cut grass carried on the breeze. Ordinary life, unfolding all around me. I realized then how much of it I had missed, trapped in my mother's orbit. As I sipped my coffee, I whispered to myself, "This is where it starts." It wasn't dramatic or triumphant. It was simple, almost fragile, like a seed planted in soil. But I could feel it taking root, deep inside me. And for the first time in a very long time, I believed there was a future waiting for me. One where my mother's voice no longer dictated the terms of my existence, and where I might finally learn how to listen to my own. The weeks that followed were a blur of paperwork, meetings, and sleepless nights. I had never set foot in a law office before, and now here I was, sitting across from a man barely older than my nephew, pouring out a lifetime of hurt that I had kept hidden even from myself. Jason, the young lawyer who agreed to take my case, listened with a seriousness that surprised me. He didn't flinch when I described my mother's control over every decision, nor when I explained how the house, the very one I had poured my soul into maintaining, was legally tied up in her name. He just took notes, nodded, and said, "We'll start by getting everything on paper, step by step." That phrase, step by step, became my anchor. I wanted to sprint toward freedom, but the reality was slower, heavier. Legal petitions, financial statements, endless questions about documents I didn't know if I still had. I would leave his office with a stack of forms, my stomach knotted, wondering if I had the strength to follow through. Every signature felt like a rebellion, and every form submitted carried the risk of retaliation. And of course, retaliation came. Margaret had a way of making her displeasure known, even without saying a word to me directly. Old friends stopped calling. Neighbors who once waved now crossed the street. Somehow she had woven her version of the story into the fabric of the community. I was the ungrateful daughter, the betrayer, the one who had abandoned her aging mother in her time of need. Walking down the grocery aisle became a gauntlet of cold stares and whispered conversations. Jason reminded me again and again, "This is what happens when someone loses control. She's fighting to keep you under her thumb. Stay the course." I tried to hold on to that. Some nights I succeeded. Others, I cried myself to sleep, terrified I was making a mistake, that maybe I should have just endured quietly until the end of her life. But then I remembered her words at the party, the sting of that public humiliation, and I knew I could never go back. Court dates began filling my calendar. The first hearing was a disaster in my eyes. I sat across from my mother in that sterile courtroom, her expression sharp, her eyes burning with disdain. She wore her best suit, her silver hair perfectly set, as though she had dressed not for the judge but for an audience she alone could see. When she spoke, her voice dripped with righteousness. "Everything I've done has been for Ellen. She's confused, she's unwell, she doesn't know what she's asking for." My heart pounded so loud I was certain the judge could hear it. I wanted to scream, to lay bare the years of control, the sacrifices that left me hollow, but instead I sat frozen, letting Jason do the talking. He spoke calmly, laying out facts, showing records, highlighting inconsistencies. I couldn't breathe until the gavel struck to end the session, and even then, relief didn't come. The battle had only just begun. Back in the motel room that night, I stared at the ceiling and felt the weight of it pressing down on me. This wasn't a single confrontation. It was a war of attrition. Margaret had money, influence, and the sheer willpower of a woman who had never lost a fight. All I had was determination, and a lawyer who believed I had a right to a life of my own. I thought about calling her, trying to negotiate privately, to end it without dragging both of us through the mud. But then I imagined her voice on the other end of the line, smooth and manipulative, drawing me back into the same cycle I had fought to escape. No, I couldn't risk it. Not now. Not after taking those first steps. So I held fast. Each court date chipped away at me, leaving me more exhausted, but also more certain. Each small victory, an acknowledgement of my contribution to the home, a judge's recognition that my financial independence mattered, felt like a stone placed on a new foundation. Slowly, painfully, I was building something that looked like freedom. And yet deep inside I knew this was only the beginning. Margaret was not a woman who surrendered easily. She would come at me with every trick she had, every ounce of venom in her arsenal. The real test was still ahead. But as I drifted to sleep that night, clutching the folder of documents Jason had prepared, I whispered a quiet prayer to myself. Hold on, Ellen. Just hold on. The second round of hearings came quicker than I was ready for. I sat once again in that cold courtroom, the air heavy with the scent of paper and polish, my mother across the aisle like a queen preparing for battle. She never looked at me directly. Instead, she whispered to her attorney, occasionally glancing around as if she owned the room. To anyone who didn't know her, she must have looked like a dignified, wronged woman. But I knew the truth hiding beneath that polished exterior. This was the same woman who had taught me that my voice didn't matter, the same woman who turned every sacrifice I made into a debt I could never repay. Jason leaned closer and whispered, "Stay calm. Don't let her bait you." His confidence steadied me, though my hands still trembled against the table. The proceedings dragged on. Margaret's lawyer painted me as irresponsible, a daughter who had squandered opportunities and now sought to take what wasn't mine. I felt heat rising in my face, shame mixing with anger. But Jason countered with documents, evidence of the years I'd worked, the money I had contributed, the choices I had set aside to take care of her. The judge listened, impassive, and I realized just how much of my life had been reduced to numbers on paper. When it ended that day, we didn't win or lose. The case moved forward, no closer to resolution. But walking out of that courthouse, I felt hollow, as though I'd left pieces of myself scattered on the floor behind me. Margaret lingered by the steps, surrounded by people she had charmed into her version of events. I kept my head down, but out of the corner of my eye I saw her lips curve into a smile. That smile chilled me more than any of her words ever had. Back at the motel, exhaustion hit me like a tidal wave. I collapsed onto the bed, staring at the ceiling until tears finally spilled over. The silence pressed heavy. I thought about calling Jason, asking if he really believed we stood a chance, but I already knew his answer. "Step by step," he'd say again. Still, I wondered how many steps I had left in me. To make ends meet, I had picked up a part-time job at a nearby diner. It was hardly glamorous, pouring coffee and clearing tables, but it gave me a paycheck, and more importantly, a sense that I wasn't entirely dependent on anyone. My feet ached at the end of every shift, my hair smelled of fried food, but when customers thanked me with a smile, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, useful in my own right, independent. But Margaret didn't let me keep even that small slice of peace. Word spread quickly, and soon enough one of her friends happened to stop by the diner, sitting at a booth with a smirk on her face. She didn't need to say a word. Her presence alone carried the message, "We're watching you. We know what you're doing." That night I broke down in the tiny bathroom of the motel room, sobbing into a towel so the neighbors wouldn't hear. The weight of it all felt unbearable. The court battles, the gossip, the feeling of being hunted even in the smallest corners of my new life. And yet, beneath the despair, there was a spark of defiance. Margaret could send her spies, she could twist the story, but she couldn't unmake the truth of what had already begun inside me. The next morning I returned to Jason's office, weary but determined. He looked at me over the rim of his glasses and said, "I know this feels endless, but every appearance, every document filed, every argument we make, it builds your case. She wants to exhaust you so you'll give up. Don't let her win by quitting." His words sat heavy in my chest, but they also steadied me. For decades I had been the one to fold, to stay quiet, to avoid conflict. Not this time. Margaret had taken enough of my life. She wasn't going to take the rest. That night, lying awake on the motel bed, I let myself imagine the end of it. The papers signed, the ruling made, the house finally mine. I imagined standing in those rooms stripped of her presence, filling them with my own breath, my own laughter. I imagined painting the walls with colors that belonged to me. The battle wasn't over, and I knew darker days still lay ahead, but as I closed my eyes, I clung to that image, fragile and stubborn, because hope, however small, was the only weapon I had left. And maybe, just maybe, it was enough. The third hearing felt different from the start. The air in the courtroom seemed thicker, charged with an energy that made my stomach twist. Margaret sat across from me, perfectly composed, her hands folded neatly on the table as though she were attending a luncheon instead of a legal battle. She didn't have to speak for me to feel her contempt. It radiated off her, the same silent judgment I'd lived under for decades. This time, Jason had prepared me for a confrontation. He explained that Margaret's lawyer would attempt to discredit me, to provoke a reaction, anything to paint me as unstable or ungrateful. "Stay calm," he reminded me again, placing a reassuring hand on my arm. "The truth is on your side. Don't let her drag you back into the role she's written for you." When the questioning began, I felt every eye in the room pressing on me. Margaret's lawyer leaned forward, voice smooth and practiced, asking about my finances, my choices, the years I had lived under my mother's roof. Each question carried an accusation beneath it, as if my very existence had been a failure. My throat tightened, but I answered carefully, truthfully. I spoke about giving up my scholarship, about years of caregiving, about how my contributions had been erased as though they never existed. Then came the breaking point. Jason presented records, bank statements showing Margaret had withdrawn large sums from the account that held both our names. Money I had earned from small jobs over the years, money I thought was safe. Seeing those numbers projected in black and white made my pulse roar in my ears. I turned to her then, unable to hold back. "That was my money too," I said, my voice low but steady. "You had no right." Margaret's composure cracked for the briefest moment. Her lips curled, her eyes flashing with fury as she snapped, "Ungrateful. Everything you have came from me. Don't you dare stand there and call yourself a victim." The judge banged the gavel for order, but the damage was done. Everyone in that room had heard it, the venom in her voice, the dismissal in her words. For once, it wasn't just me in the shadows of her cruelty. I sat back, trembling, but also strangely calm. I looked at her and said quietly, "I don't owe you my life anymore." Silence followed, heavy and undeniable. Jason gave me the smallest nod, and I knew he understood. We had reached a turning point. This wasn't just about property or money anymore. It was about truth finally finding its way into the open, after years of being buried. Walking out of that courthouse, the sun hit my face, and for the first time in months, I felt lighter. The battle was far from over, but a line had been drawn. I had spoken out loud what I had only ever whispered to myself in the dark. And that truth, fragile as it was, felt like the first real victory. The weeks after that courtroom exchange were some of the hardest I can remember. On the surface, nothing had been decided. The case was still in motion, the hearings still scheduled, the paperwork still piling up. But something had shifted. I had looked my mother in the eye and told her I didn't owe her my life anymore. For the first time, she knew I wasn't going to bend. And that made her dangerous. She began calling, leaving messages that swung wildly between rage and desperation. One voicemail would be filled with accusations, how I was destroying the family, how I was a disgrace. The next would be soft, trembling, her voice laced with feigned fragility. "Ellen, sweetheart, I don't feel well. I need you. Please don't abandon me." Hearing her like that twisted my stomach, because I had spent so many years rushing to her side whenever she needed anything. It had been my reflex, my identity. But now, each time the phone buzzed, I forced myself not to answer. I deleted the messages, but her words lingered like smoke in my lungs. Then came the night she showed up at my motel. I heard the knock and froze. When I opened the door a crack, there she was. My mother, standing in the dim glow of the hallway light, clutching her chest, gasping as if she were in the middle of a heart attack. Instinct screamed at me to reach for her, to call an ambulance, to step back into the role I had played all my life. But another part of me, the part that remembered her cruelty in front of that birthday crowd, the stolen money, the endless manipulations, kept me rooted to the floor. "Please, Ellen," she wheezed, her hand pressed dramatically against her heart. "I can't do this without you." For a long, shaking moment, I almost gave in. But then I saw the flicker in her eyes, the same flicker I had seen 100 times before when she knew she had me cornered. And I realized she wasn't just asking for help. She was testing me, waiting for me to slip back into obedience. I stepped outside the room, keeping my voice calm. "If you're truly sick, I'll call the police. They can send an ambulance." Her face hardened instantly, the performance collapsing. She dropped her hand, straightened her back, and glared at me with a fury that chilled me more than the night air ever could. Without another word, she turned and walked away, her heels striking the floor like gunshots. I stood there trembling, my heart racing, but I didn't follow. I didn't chase after her. I closed the door, locked it, and sat on the edge of the bed, shaking from head to toe. For the first time in my life, I had not answered her call. And though fear and guilt churned inside me, there was also something else rising quietly beneath it. Strength. That night, as I lay awake staring at the ceiling, I whispered to myself, "She doesn't own me anymore." It was a small sentence, but saying it out loud felt like reclaiming a piece of my soul, and I knew no matter what storm she brought next, I would never again let her drag me back into the shadows. When the final round of hearings came, the air outside the courthouse felt different, like the sky itself was holding its breath. I walked up the stone steps with Jason beside me, my heart pounding as though it wanted to burst through my chest. I had lived through months of motions, arguments, and manipulations, but today would be the day something finally gave way. Inside, the judge's voice echoed across the room, steady and unshaken. I sat at the table, hands clasped so tightly I could feel the pulse in my fingertips. Margaret was across from me, dressed in her finest again, every strand of hair in place, her expression composed in a mask of dignity. But I could see the tension in her jaw, the faint twitch of her fingers against the folder she clutched. She was bracing herself, the same way I was. The lawyers spoke first, their words filling the room with the language of property and ownership, of legal rights and obligations. Yet beneath the legalities, I knew what was really on trial wasn't just a house, it was my independence. My right to step out from under her shadow and finally live as my own person. At one point, the judge asked me directly, "Why do you believe this home should be yours?" My throat went dry, but I forced myself to answer. "Because I built a life in that house. I gave up my education to care for my mother after her accident. I worked, I contributed, and I stayed, even when I was told I wasn't enough. I'm not here to erase her role, but I won't allow mine to be erased either. That house isn't just four walls. It's the years of my life that I gave away, and I deserve to have something to show for it." For a moment, silence hung heavy. Then Margaret rose to speak, her voice carrying that familiar sharpness. "She's lying. Everything she had, I provided. I gave her shelter, food, a roof over her head, and this is how she repays me, by trying to take what is mine." Her words sliced through me, but instead of shrinking, I sat taller. For once, the weight of her accusations didn't crush me. They revealed her for who she was. The judge delivered his decision days later, but I remember the exact words. "The property will be transferred to Ellen Carter." My knees almost buckled. It wasn't just about the bricks or the deed, it was about the validation, the acknowledgement that my sacrifices had mattered, that my existence could not be written off. Outside the courthouse, sunlight spilled across the steps. I breathed it in like oxygen, tears welling in my eyes. Margaret walked past me without a word, her face a storm of fury she could no longer disguise. She climbed into the back of a waiting car, and as the door shut, I knew a chapter of my life had closed with it. I stood there for a long while, clutching the papers Jason handed me. My hands trembled, but inside me there was a steadiness I had never known. For the first time, the future was not something my mother could dictate. It was mine. And that realization filled me with a quiet, radiant peace I had been chasing all my life. The first morning I stepped back into the house after the ruling, I could hardly recognize it. It was the same place I had lived for decades, the same walls and floors I had scrubbed and polished until my hands ached, but it felt different now. The air seemed lighter, the silence no longer oppressive but full of possibility. For the first time, the house wasn't hers. It was mine. I walked through each room slowly, almost reverently, touching the walls, running my fingers over the furniture as though confirming it all belonged to me. There were shadows everywhere, ghosts of arguments, echoes of slammed doors, the residue of years where my voice had been silenced. But there was also something else. Potential. I could paint over those ghosts. I could fill this space with something entirely new. That afternoon, I went to the hardware store and bought paint. Bright, warm colors that my mother would have despised. Margaret believed every wall should be beige, every curtain heavy, every space muted and controlled. I chose a soft yellow for the kitchen, a pale blue for the bedroom, and a bold terracotta for the living room wall that caught the afternoon sun. The clerk smiled as I loaded the cans into my cart, and for the first time in a long time, I caught myself smiling back. Back home, I laid out drop cloths and cracked open the first can. The smell of fresh paint filled the air, sharp and new. I dipped the roller and pressed it against the wall, watching the dull beige disappear under a wash of color. It felt almost ceremonial, as though I was erasing years of her control with every stroke. My arms ached, my clothes were splattered, but I didn't care. With each pass of the roller, the house became less hers and more mine. I put on music while I worked, songs I hadn't listened to since I was a teenager. Margaret hated noise. She said music was a distraction from responsibility. Now I let it pour through the speakers, filling every corner. As the notes carried through the rooms, I found myself humming, then singing, my voice shaky at first but growing stronger. I laughed when I caught sight of myself in the mirror. Paint in my hair, a streak across my cheek, my hands stained with color. It was messy, imperfect, alive. Later, I unpacked an old box of art supplies I hadn't touched in years. Brushes, tubes of paint, a sketchbook still half filled with drawings from another lifetime. My fingers trembled as I pulled them out, as though I was meeting an old friend after decades apart. I set up a small corner by the window where the light fell just right. Sitting there with a brush in hand, I felt something stir inside me, something I thought I had lost forever, the joy of creating. The canvas welcomed me back without judgment, and soon shapes and colors began to emerge, tentative but real. In the evenings, I sat in the backyard, the one place Margaret never cared to cultivate. I bought small pots of herbs and flowers, arranging them in the soil with my bare hands. The earth was cool and damp, the scent grounding. As I pressed the seedlings into place, I whispered to myself, "Grow." It felt like more than a command to the plants. It felt like a prayer to my own spirit. Each small act, a brushstroke, a planted seed, a song sung out loud, was a declaration. This was my life now. I wasn't waiting for permission. I wasn't waiting for someone to approve or disapprove. I was simply living, shaping the space around me in a way that reflected who I was, not who she wanted me to be. One night, as I stood in the living room, surrounded by walls glowing with new color, the faint scent of flowers drifting in from the yard, I realized something had shifted inside me. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was building. And though the road ahead was still uncertain, one truth anchored me to the ground. I was free. And freedom, however fragile, was the most beautiful color I had ever seen. In the weeks that followed, I began piecing together a life I had almost forgotten I wanted. Each morning I woke to the sunlight streaming through freshly painted walls, and instead of dread, I felt anticipation. There was no voice barking orders from the next room, no footsteps reminding me that I owed my existence to someone else. The silence now carried a different weight. It was peaceful, like a soft blanket wrapping around me. I enrolled in a community art class at the local college. Walking into that classroom with a sketchbook under my arm, I felt both terrified and exhilarated. The room was filled with people of all ages, retirees, young students, parents finally making time for themselves. No one knew my story. No one looked at me as Margaret's daughter. I was simply Ellen, the woman with paint-stained hands and a cautious smile. When the instructor encouraged us to paint what you feel, my brush trembled at first. But as color spread across the canvas, something loosened inside me. I wasn't painting for approval. I was painting because I was alive. Outside of class, I started walking in the park near my neighborhood. At first, the quiet paths felt lonely, but soon I noticed familiar faces. The woman who walked her dog every morning, the elderly couple who fed the ducks, the jogger who always nodded as he passed. These small interactions warmed me in a way I hadn't expected. They reminded me that the world was still out there, waiting for me to step into it. One afternoon I had tea with Mrs. Kelly, my old neighbor who had once slipped me that letter of encouragement. We sat at her kitchen table, sunlight spilling across the worn wood as she listened without judgment. "Ellen," she said gently, "what you've done isn't abandonment. It's survival. You've given yourself permission to breathe." Her words sank deep, soothing a part of me that still ached with guilt. That night I sat in my backyard under the stars, the scent of fresh soil and flowers drifting in the air. I closed my eyes and let the stillness settle into my bones. For the first time in decades, I wasn't waiting for the next storm. I was simply present, my heart steady, my spirit beginning to heal. And in that moment I knew, this was the life I was meant to live. Healing didn't come all at once. It arrived in pieces, like sunlight breaking through clouds after a long storm. Some mornings I woke up with a sense of lightness I could barely recognize, only to have it vanish by afternoon when old memories crept in. Other days, guilt sat heavy on my chest, whispering that I had betrayed my mother, that I had walked away from the woman who had given me life. It was a push and pull, but slowly, I learned to sit with those feelings without letting them define me. Books became my companions. I filled the shelves with titles about boundaries, recovery, and rediscovering self-worth. Each page seemed to put words to emotions I had carried for years without knowing how to name them. I underlined passages, wrote notes in the margins, and sometimes simply held the book against my chest, letting the truth of it sink into me. I wasn't alone. My story wasn't unusual. There were countless others who had lived under the shadow of control and still managed to find their way into the light. One Sunday afternoon, I returned to Mrs. Kelly's kitchen for tea. The warm smell of cinnamon filled the air as she poured steaming cups and listened patiently. I told her about my fears, about nights when I still dreamed of my mother's voice, about mornings when I wondered if I had made a terrible mistake. Mrs. Kelly reached across the table and took my hand. "Ellen," she said softly, "freedom doesn't mean you won't grieve. It means you've given yourself the chance to heal, and healing takes time." Her words stayed with me. That evening, I walked through my backyard, where tiny green shoots had begun pushing through the soil I had turned over weeks earlier. Kneeling down, I pressed my hand to the earth, marveling at the stubbornness of life. Growth wasn't fast. It wasn't neat. But it happened, quietly and persistently. And maybe that was true for me as well. I began journaling each night, writing not only about the pain but also about the small victories. The first time I laughed without feeling guilty, the first time I went to a cafe alone and enjoyed it, the first time I looked in the mirror and didn't see a stranger. The pages began to fill with moments of strength, proof that I was building something new. At art class, my canvases grew bolder. Colors spilled onto the page, no longer timid, no longer afraid of being too loud. My classmates noticed. One woman leaned over during a break and said, "Your paintings feel alive." I smiled, a little embarrassed, but inside I felt a rush of pride I hadn't known in years. Healing was messy. Some nights I still cried myself to sleep. But even through the tears, I understood something important. I wasn't broken. I was rebuilding. And like the seedlings in my backyard, I would keep growing toward the light, no matter how many times the storm tried to push me back down. The morning I planted the first seeds in my garden, the air was cool and damp with dew. I knelt in the dirt, my jeans already stained, my hands buried in the soil. There was something sacred about pressing those tiny seeds into the earth, covering them gently, whispering to them as if they could hear me. "Grow," I said softly. It wasn't just a command to the garden. It was a prayer to myself. The backyard had once been nothing more than a patch of neglected grass. Margaret never cared for it. She said gardens were messy, too much work for too little reward. But I wanted it messy. I wanted life pushing up from the ground, green and stubborn, reminding me that even after years of neglect, beauty could return. Each morning, I checked on the soil, crouching down to see if anything had broken through. At first, it was only dirt, but one day, a single green shoot poked its way upward. I gasped, laughing at how such a tiny thing could stir such joy. That fragile sprout became a symbol of everything I was fighting for, proof that beginnings didn't have to be grand to matter. I carried that sense of renewal with me into the house. I opened the windows wide, letting fresh air rush through every room. The scent of paint still lingered faintly, mixed now with the perfume of flowers blooming just outside. I filled the silence with music and the scratch of my paintbrush against canvas. Where once the house had been heavy with Margaret's control, now it rang with my laughter, my choices, my voice. One evening, I sat in the living room surrounded by canvases. The setting sun painted the walls in shades of gold and orange, and for the first time, I didn't feel like an intruder in my own home. I was exactly where I belonged. My brushes lay scattered on the floor, my hands stained with color, my heart beating steady. I whispered almost in disbelief, "This is mine. All of it. Mine." Yet freedom did not mean loneliness. Slowly I began reconnecting with the world outside my four walls. I joined my art classmates for coffee after sessions, something I would have once declined out of habit. I visited Mrs. Kelly more often, grateful for her steady presence and wise words. These small connections reminded me that independence didn't mean isolation. It meant choosing who to let into my life, on my own terms. That night, I returned to the garden with a lantern. The air was cool, crickets chirped, and the soil smelled rich and alive. I crouched down to touch the small leaves that had begun to spread. My heart swelled as I realized the truth. I was growing alongside them. The storms of the past had not destroyed me. They had tilled the ground, painful as it was, so that something new could take root. And as I stood under the night sky, lantern light glowing against the tender green shoots, I understood that freedom was not just about walking away. It was about choosing to plant, to nurture, to build a life that reflected who I truly was. The garden would take time. So would I. But both, I knew, would bloom. The morning of the final decision, I woke before dawn. The house was still, the air cool, and for a moment I just sat at the edge of the bed listening to the silence. My hands were steady, but my heart pounded like a drum in my chest. Today would decide everything: the house, the years of sacrifice, and most of all, my freedom. Jason met me outside the courthouse. He gave me a small, encouraging smile, the kind of smile you give when you know words won't be enough. "You're ready?" he said simply. I nodded, though I wasn't sure if I believed him. Inside, the courtroom was colder than usual. The fluorescent lights hummed above us, and the sound of shuffling papers filled the air. Margaret was already there, sitting tall in her chair. She wore her best suit again, her jewelry catching the light, her chin lifted with that same regal pride she had carried all her life. She didn't look at me, not once. But I could feel her presence like a weight pressing against my chest. The judge's words were deliberate, each one heavy with meaning. He spoke about evidence, about contributions, about fairness. I sat frozen, my palms damp against the table, waiting for the sentence that would determine the course of my life. Margaret's lawyer argued fiercely, painting her as the victim, the woman who had given me everything. Jason countered with calm persistence, reminding the court of the sacrifices I had made, the years I had worked, the money that had vanished from our shared accounts. Then, in a voice steady and firm, the judge said the words I will never forget. "The property will be awarded to Ellen Carter." For a moment, I didn't breathe. The room seemed to tilt, the sounds around me fading into a blur. I stared down at the papers in front of me, trying to absorb what had just been said. The house was mine. Not because I stole it, not because I demanded more than I deserved, but because the truth had finally been recognized. Margaret's chair scraped against the floor as she stood. She gathered her things with sharp, clipped movements, her face pale with fury. She walked past me without a glance, the scent of her perfume lingering in the air like smoke. Outside, I watched as she climbed into the back of a black car and shut the door with finality. For once, it wasn't me being left behind. I stepped out of the courthouse into the sunlight. The air felt different, lighter, clearer, as though the world itself had shifted. Jason handed me a copy of the ruling, and my hands shook as I held it. "You did it," he said softly. But I knew it wasn't just me. It was every small decision, every tear, every night I had spent convincing myself not to give up. On the courthouse steps, I let the papers press against my chest and lifted my face to the sky. Tears slipped down my cheeks, but this time they weren't from shame or grief. They were from release. For the first time in my life, I felt the weight slide from my shoulders. I was no longer fighting to be seen. I had been seen. And in that moment, beneath the wide blue sky, I realized something simple and profound. I was finally free. When I returned to the house that afternoon, it was empty in a way it had never been before. The furniture was the same, the walls freshly painted with the colors I had chosen, but the air no longer carried her presence. It was quiet, honestly, achingly quiet, but it was mine. I stood in the doorway, sunlight spilling across the floorboards, and whispered to myself, "This is home." The words felt foreign and familiar all at once. I wandered from room to room, lingering in spaces that once felt suffocating. The living room where I had endured her endless criticisms, the kitchen where I had cooked meal after meal without thanks, the hallway where her voice used to echo, sharp and commanding. Each space carried its ghosts, but now those ghosts felt smaller, weaker. They couldn't hold me anymore. I opened the back door and stepped into the yard. The garden I had started weeks before was beginning to bloom. Small flowers pushed their way through the soil, their colors bright against the green. I knelt down and touched the petals, fragile yet strong, and thought about how much had changed. Like the garden, I had been buried under years of weight, but somehow I had found the strength to grow. As the sun dipped lower, I made myself a simple dinner: pasta, fresh bread, a glass of wine. I set the table for one and sat quietly, savoring every bite. It wasn't loneliness I felt in that moment. It was peace. I didn't have to rush, didn't have to brace for criticism or anticipate the next demand. For the first time, I could simply be. Later, I stood at the window watching the sky turn shades of orange and purple. The house glowed in the fading light, warm and alive, no longer a cage but a refuge. I pressed my hand to the glass and whispered, "You're mine now." It wasn't just about the house, of course. It was about reclaiming myself, the woman who had been silenced for too long. I knew there would still be hard days ahead, but as I turned off the lights and climbed into bed that night, I carried a new certainty in my chest. I wasn't afraid anymore. I was home, and I was finally ready to live. The first weekend after the ruling, I stood in the center of the living room with the windows open wide. A breeze carried in the scent of freshly cut grass, and sunlight poured across the terracotta wall I had painted weeks earlier. The house didn't feel heavy anymore. It breathed with me. For so long it had been her stage, her throne, her place of judgment. Now it was becoming a sanctuary, a space where I could finally hear my own voice. I unpacked boxes that had been sitting untouched for years. At the bottom of one I found my old sketchbooks, pages filled with half-finished drawings, quick portraits, and splashes of color I had once been proud of. I ran my fingers over the paper, feeling both sadness and excitement. Sadness for the years I had lost, and excitement for the years I still had left to create. I placed the sketchbooks on a shelf in the living room, not hidden away but displayed, as if to say, "These are mine, and they matter." That afternoon, I invited Mrs. Kelly over. She walked through the front door slowly, her eyes scanning the walls, the furniture, the space that looked familiar but somehow transformed. "It feels different," she said softly. "It feels like you." I smiled, a warmth rising in my chest. We sat at the kitchen table with cups of tea, and for the first time, I didn't feel like a guest in my own home. I was the host, offering hospitality freely, not out of obligation. After she left, I wandered into the backyard where my small garden had begun to flourish. The flowers swayed gently in the breeze, and the herbs released a faint fragrance when I brushed my hand across them. I crouched down and touched the soil, still damp from yesterday's rain. It struck me how something so fragile could take root and survive if given just a little space, a little care. As dusk settled, I lit a candle in the living room and sat quietly, watching the flame flicker against the freshly painted walls. The house no longer echoed with her voice. It echoed with mine, my laughter, my music, my silence. I knew healing wouldn't be a straight path. I knew there would still be nights of doubt, mornings of old memories pressing in. But I also knew this: I had crossed a threshold I could never uncross. The house was mine, the life was mine, and little by little I was learning that I was mine too. The first time I woke without dread in my chest, it startled me. For years, mornings had been heavy, filled with the sound of her footsteps in the hall, the sharp edge of her voice, the endless list of duties waiting for me before I even poured a cup of coffee. But that morning was different. I opened my eyes to sunlight spilling across the soft blue of my bedroom wall, and for a long moment I just lay there, breathing. I padded into the kitchen barefoot, humming a tune without realizing it. The kettle hissed, the coffee brewed, and the silence wasn't something to fear anymore. It was mine. I sat at the table with my mug and let the warmth seep into my hands, watching the light shift across the room. No one was there to criticize how I held the cup or remind me that I was wasting time. I was free to simply exist. Later that day, I went for a walk in the park. The trees were heavy with summer leaves, and children's laughter floated across the playground. I stopped at a bench, letting the breeze carry the scent of cut grass and wildflowers. Watching strangers live their lives, parents chasing toddlers, joggers with their headphones, an elderly couple sharing an ice cream cone, I felt something stir inside me. This was life in its simplest form, and for once I wasn't just an observer. I belonged to it too. That evening I stood in the backyard beside my garden. Tiny green shoots had grown taller, their leaves stretching toward the sky. I knelt in the dirt, brushing soil from my palms, and realized they were teaching me something. Healing doesn't happen overnight. It comes in small, stubborn increments, just like growth. You don't see it until suddenly the ground is covered in green. As the sun dipped low, I whispered to myself, "I'm not broken. I'm beginning." The words felt fragile, but they carried a weight I hadn't felt before. For years, I had lived under someone else's story. Now I was finally writing my own. Some evenings I still felt the ache of loneliness, but it no longer swallowed me whole the way it once did. I had begun to fill those quiet hours with small rituals that made me feel anchored. A pot of tea steeping on the stove, a record playing softly in the background, the steady scratch of my pen across the pages of a journal. Writing became a place where I could set down everything: my grief, my anger, my hopes for the future, without fear of being silenced. The more I wrote, the lighter I felt, as though every word I released onto the paper gave me back a piece of myself. I also started spending more time with Mrs. Kelly. She had a way of listening that made me feel seen, like nothing I said was too heavy or too small. One afternoon, as we walked through her garden, I confessed the guilt that still tugged at me. "There are nights," I told her, "when I wonder if I abandoned her, if I'm the selfish one." She stopped, turned to me, and said gently, "Ellen, surviving is not selfish. Wanting a life of your own isn't betrayal, it's human." Her words sank deep into me, soothing a wound I hadn't been able to touch. For so long I had equated love with sacrifice, duty with worth. But maybe real love wasn't about erasing yourself. Maybe it was about being whole enough to give without breaking. In art class, my brushstrokes grew braver. I began painting not just shapes and colors, but pieces of my story, abstract forms that carried anger, loss, and renewal. One canvas in particular felt like a breakthrough, a stormy gray background with a single burst of yellow breaking through the center. When I finished it, I stepped back and realized it wasn't just a painting, it was me. One evening after class, a few of my classmates invited me for coffee. For a moment, I almost declined out of habit, but then I heard myself saying yes. We sat together at a little cafe, laughing about smudged paint and crooked lines. I didn't share my full story, at least not yet, but I didn't feel invisible either. I was part of something, however small, and it was enough. Back home that night, I stood at the window looking out at the garden. The flowers were blooming stronger now, colors spilling into every corner of the yard. I thought about how fragile they had once seemed, how easily they could have withered, and yet here they were, thriving. I whispered to the glass, "So am I." It wasn't a declaration shouted from rooftops, but a quiet truth I could finally claim. Healing wasn't about erasing the past, it was about building something new in its place. And slowly, patiently, I was doing just that. The morning light poured across my backyard, bathing the garden in gold. I stood among the flowers, the soil cool beneath my bare feet, and felt a calm I had never known before. The battles were behind me now, the endless arguments, the courtroom, the years of living as someone else's shadow. What stretched ahead wasn't certain, but it was mine. For the first time, I could say that with confidence. I thought about the woman I'd been when I walked out of that birthday party months ago, broken, humiliated, unsure if I could survive without her approval. And then I thought about the woman standing here now, stronger, steadier, no longer defined by someone else's voice. I realized that freedom doesn't come all at once. It comes in small, stubborn choices, choosing to say no, choosing to walk away, choosing to believe you deserve more than a life lived in chains. As I knelt down to press a new seed into the earth, I whispered the words that had become my mantra: grow. The garden was proof that healing was possible, even after years of neglect. And so was I. If you've ever felt trapped by the weight of someone else's control, if you've ever believed that your worth depends on their approval, I want you to hear this clearly. You are not alone. You can walk away. You can build something new. It won't be easy. It won't be quick. But freedom is worth every trembling step. So as I stand here in my garden, looking toward a future filled with possibility, I invite you to reflect on your own journey. What seeds do you need to plant for yourself? What old voices do you need to silence to finally hear your own? If this story has touched you, let me know where you're watching from today. Share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe for more stories of resilience, healing, and the power to reclaim your life. Remember this: freedom is not selfish. It's the soil where love, hope, and new beginnings finally take root.